Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's Farm Foundation Forum, Building a Sustainable International Agricultural Framework. We're glad to be able to engage with you and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Tim Brennan. I'm Vice President of Programs and Strategic Impact at Farm Foundation, located on our beautiful new Innovation and Education campus in Libertyville, Illinois, which you just saw a little bit about. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and we'll explore some critical questions at the intersections of sustainability and trade. But before we get into today's program, I'm going to just take a few minutes to share a little bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we're an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers that we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships and coalitions to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, I encourage you to reach out. I'd now like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you'll not only be helping support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you'll also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for our farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends. The link has also been posted in the chat section. So in addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect with us on social media platforms. If you're posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you please use the hashtag Farm Foundation Forum. Before I hand the floor over to our moderator today, I'd like to talk through a couple of last-minute housekeeping notes. First, there'll be an audience question and answer session at the end of the forum. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, to queue the questions. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. We'll also send you the link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll receive a link for a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback and your time in completing that survey. Now let's turn to the forum. Today's panel of experts will be moderated by Farm Foundation's President and CEO, Sherry Rogie-Fidler. Sherry is a fifth-generation farm owner and operator, an entrepreneur in the organic branded food industry, and the founder of an agribusiness consulting firm. She was also the CEO of a group of companies serving over 1,000 farmers. She's lived and worked abroad for many years, including in London in the financial services industry and across Europe with the Boston Consulting Group. Thank you for moderating today's session, Sherry, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for setting the stage for our discussion today. And before we get started, I also want to give a shout out to our team member, Katie Merkel, who's the magic behind the scenes, making it all happen today. So I appreciate your help today too, Katie. And welcome to everyone who is here today, and welcome to those who will be watching this later on YouTube. We are really looking forward to an engaging discussion with our amazing panelists today and on such an important and timely topic. Of course, we had no idea when we set this forum, long ago, that it would be such a hot topic today. So I think that will really add to the importance of this discussion with our guests today. Just as a reminder, we are a nonpartisan organization, and I think that's critical to say at the outset. And trade has been an important part of our work over the arc of our lifetime for over 90 years, and it remains important in our portfolio today. And we engage in a variety of ways. I do just want to give a shout out that we just announced our new Ag Econ Fellow, who will also be working on trade. So you can watch for more work and watch our social media and website for that as well. Our guests today have been involved with us over the last several years as we've worked on trade. So they're each friends of Farm Foundation from around the globe, and they each deserve a special thank you for the time zone challenges of showing up today. So really appreciate that as well. We have engaged with them in our work in our US-China trade series several years ago, as well as our active work now. And they bring different perspectives. So that's core to Farm Foundation, is highlighting different perspectives on the critical issues in agriculture today. So we'll look forward to that as we dig in today. So next slide, please. So I do want to anchor us in our global collaboration, Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation. We launched this global collaboration just a few years ago with our partners, the Australian Farm Institute, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. And as we started that a few years ago, we tried to set the stage for what issue do we want to work on together. And we all knew that trade was going to be critical. And then we thought, well, what aspect of trade do we want to look at? And at that particular time, we felt around the globe that sustainability had tailwinds both in the policy environment and in the private marketplace. So we chose to focus on that nexus of trade and sustainability as our starting place. And so we will be anchoring on the next slide, please. Anchoring our discussion as a jumping off point on our last gathering and our last paper that we've produced. We had our first session at the OECD in Paris, looking at trade and sustainability, and then had a follow-up session in Washington, D.C. And this paper that you see here focuses on that second workshop that we held in Washington, D.C., and reflects the issues that all of the participants shared at that workshop. And we'll be teasing out some of those, again, as a starting place, a jumping off place in our discussion today. But we will then, of course, tackle the timely issues that we're all facing around the globe with some changes in trade policy. We are also looking at, as a global collaboration, at how we might change or shift our priorities as we move forward to reflect the current environment. So we'll be discussing that and look for your input and guidance on that as well if you have suggestions. So please share that in the chat as well. Next slide, please. I do want to just anchor a couple of slides before I introduce our first speaker. And as GIFPI, as we lovingly call our global collaboration, as we got started looking at this trade and sustainability collaboration, we started from a place of different perspectives. We don't all share the same perspectives on trade and sustainability. And that's part of the point of Farm Foundation, is bringing those different perspectives to light. And from the US perspective, as you see here, our friends at the University of Illinois and FarmDoc shared that across party lines in the US, there's really a tendency to focus on the carrot rather than the stick, whether it's the government or the private sector. And that is something that as GIFPI, we started to talk about. You know, on the one hand, some of our GIFPI partners are looking at how can trade advance sustainability, but we also have tackled how might sustainability be causing a trade barrier in some of our relationships. So we have not been shying away from those issues, as we will not be shying away from them today. Next slide, please. And then I did want to just anchor us again in the US and with the change of administrations, that as you see here on the left, the map just shows the strong support for this administration in farm country, in the counties where agriculture is especially dominant. You can see that here on the left. And then on the right, some of the US farmer views of that US producers broadly prefer market payments over government payments, but need one or the other. And that trade is a top concern for US producers, even over crop insurance. And Purdue University just took the pulse of US producers, and I commend their study too if you want to look online for that. It's almost a 3-to-1 gap between trade being the top priority of US producers versus crop insurance, which are typically the top two for US producers. So that just shows the significance of our topic today to US producers. Then I also highlighted here the American Farm Bureau just held their annual meeting, and in terms of their policy priorities, you see one of the ones they voted on there was support for reviewing the US-Mexico Canada agreement, which of course is especially timely as well. Next slide, please. So with that, I want to start to shift to our panel discussion. Each of our panelists I'll introduce in turn, and they'll share their perspectives. Then we'll have a brief discussion as a panel and then open to Q&A. Just as a reminder, throughout the conversation today, you can put your questions in the Q&A section down below here in the webinar. Next slide, please. So it would be so easy for me to just introduce each of our panelists as my friends and what I know about them as friends, but I am going to try to read so that I can highlight some different aspects of their background. So first I want to introduce Mark Titterington. Mark has extensive international experience in sustainability and corporate affairs leadership, in both listed and privately held companies and not-for-profit organizations. He's the co-founder and director of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. He also co-leads Indigo Agriculture's Sustainability Policy and Public Affairs team and is a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Policy Network. In addition, he is the host of the Food Systems podcast, and we're happy to have you here today, Mark, and over to you.
Great. Thank you, Shari. And let me say good morning to everyone, or afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a great pleasure to be here. So to offer you a perspective, I suppose, on this nexus of sustainability and innovation and trade, and what that means for us in Europe, and how we've played into some of the work that we've been doing with Shari and our friends in Australia and Canada on our GIFME work on sustainability and agri-food trade. I thought I'd start by just saying that, as in the US and elsewhere, we live on uncertain times in Europe as well. We just had a new commission effectively take office, European Commission take office. And of course, we have political instability in many parts of Europe as we go through election challenges, cycles, and political challenges domestically in countries like France and Germany, which are clearly at the heart are at the heart of EU policy making. And so I say that because our own approach, I think, in Europe to agri-food policy and what that might mean for trade and sustainability is in flux. And in the next couple of months, I think we'll start to see the lines and the contours of that become a lot clearer as the European Commission sets out its vision for agriculture. To try and get ahead of this, if you go to the next slide, last year saw an exercise commissioned by President Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, which launched a strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture in Europe. And I say this because it is absolutely critical milestone, I think, in the way that we develop our policy. Some people would argue that it was in response to some of the protests that many of you might have seen in France and Germany and across Northern Europe and other parts of Europe in the early part of last year. She actually announced that she's going to do this in her State of the Union address back in the autumn of 2023. And what it tried to do is to bring stakeholders from very different perspectives, whether you were an NGO, the farm producer groups, the agri-food industry, together to try to build a consensus around what we wanted agriculture to do in Europe and how that might also play into trade policy. And it was getting a number of key questions, which started with how do we support our farmers and our rural communities with a fair standard of living? How do we support agriculture to develop, to be sustainable within the boundaries of the planet and the ecosystem that we occupy? And how do we make better use of the opportunities that are offered by knowledge and technological innovation? And how do we promote a bright and thriving future for Europe's food system in the competitive world? And Europe's agri-food system, I would argue, is the #1 sector of the economy in Europe. If you look at its footprint in terms of employment and revenue earnings, it's truly important. I think for the first time, we had at least a declared consensus around what we actually need to do coming out of that strategic dialogue. And that is going to feed in, as I'll say in a few moments, to the vision of agriculture that the new Commissioner for Agriculture and Food will publish in the coming weeks. This report itself was published in September of last year, so there's been time to look at it, and I think it does give, in many areas, cause for optimism. As always, with reports like this, there are areas that might have some ambiguities and leave things open for interpretation. And of course, that will be the process in the coming weeks, months, and indeed years as we try and resolve that. You go to the next slide. In terms of what the recommendations of the final report last September said, I would argue that many of them actually mirror some of the things that we've talked about in the GIFBI paper on sustainability and trade. It talks and calls for a sustainability benchmarking system for agriculture and food in Europe, harmonized methodologies on actually how you do on-farm sustainability assessments, common objectives, principles, criteria, and establishing baselines with monitoring and verification tools, all very, very sensible. Of course, in the GIFBI paper, we've talked very much about anchoring that in outcomes rather than outputs. And of course, by that, when we've had those discussions within GIFBI, we've been saying that if the outcome is improved soil health, that's what we should be measuring against, not necessarily how you actually got there and the tools that you use, which may be different in different parts of the world. Real emphasis on the use of knowledge and innovation calls a lot for investment in partnerships and research, which I hope would apply not just in Europe, but indeed across the world. Sharing of those knowledge and skills, streamlining regulatory procedures and market access seen as a barrier, and leveraging the opportunities that I think are created by the bioeconomy and digitization of agriculture, which again, I think should be seen as an opportunity, if taken, to open up market access and to see sustainability, if you look at it through that lens, as being an enabler and not necessarily a barrier to trade. It also talked about preparing a fit-for-purpose common agriculture policy, which many of you will know is effectively the EU subsidy system, and how we use that to better target income support at those that really need it, and how we incentivize action on environment and social dimensions of the policy, as well as income support. And within that, something that my own forum has spent a lot of time on is how do you finance the transition? And for us, at least in my forum, we believe that includes not only the use of public subsidies, it's creative use of the tax system, which I think we see a lot of in the US and things to learn from there, the insurance schemes, the incentives that are coming from ecosystem services, the premiums for sustainably growing crops, the role of financial institutions in really understanding the risks that changing climate can have at farm level, and pricing that in and supporting our farmers and ranchers to be able to respond to that. And of course, it also does touch on the EU's trade agreement approach, and some interesting words there, I think, from the report. It says that the European Commission should ensure greater coherence between its trade and sustainability policy. Depending on your perspective, that may be seen as a very good thing, or it may indeed start to ring some additional alarm bells. It talks about the need for the Commission to better recognize the strategic relevance of agriculture and food as an economic asset for the European Union in its trade negotiations. But it also recognizes that there's a need for stronger leadership, perhaps from the EU, in reform of the global trade policy framework. And so depending on, again, where your perspective is, you might say there's some and some there in terms of the outcome of the report. So that was a kind of reflection of where the many stakeholders with different perspectives are coming from in terms of how they see the future of agriculture and food in Europe, and how that might relate to other parts of the world, particularly through our trading agreements. If you go to the next slide, really, I'd like to be able to be more definitive on what that will mean in terms of translation into policy, but as yet I'm unable to do so. We appointed at the beginning of the year a new Commissioner for Agriculture and Food, Christoph Hansen, who certainly has more than capability and enough background in food and farming, I think, to be able to make the right calls here. He, of course, has had to, as is required to in his mission letter, to draw on and respond to the outcome of the strategic dialogue. We, as the forum, have provided input to the new vision that the Commissioner is working on, focusing particularly on the benchmarking system, making the points about the need for outcomes, not necessarily outputs. We have talked about the importance of soil health within that, the emphasis on innovation, and of course, as I said, financing the transition. The vision's expected to be published in the coming weeks, and I think that will define the course of action for the Commission over the next 5 years and the extent to which some of those recommendations of the strategic dialogue are taken into account and then translated into policy. I hope that within that there's a recognition of what public policy can and also what it cannot do in terms of how that is implemented. And I think, as I say, that will give us a good indication of the direction. Until it's published, and I think given the state of flux in geopolitics, to put it diplomatically, it's hard to judge the impact that the EU's approach will have on sustainability and trade at this point. My personal view is that, like others around the world, the EU will want to work with like-minded partners, but like others, and it is there in the strategic dialogue, will use its market access leverage where necessary to promote its interest. So that's where we are from a Europe perspective, Shari. As I say, at one level, there's a lot in there that is reflective of, I think, what GIFPI has been talking about over the last couple of years in terms of sustainability as an enabler of trade, of the kind of things that we would want to see in agri-food policies and the coherence between different geographies and how we make that get along. And now we wait for the vision to see whether or not the Commission takes forward elements of that and turns it into a policy which will enable what we would like from the system. And with that, I'll hold it there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. One second, I'm just having trouble starting my video again. Katie, are you able to help? There we go. Thank you. So thank you, Mark. I appreciated your comments, and I recall experiencing the EU protests that you mentioned firsthand as part of our collaboration when I was there in Brussels. And I also have appreciated getting to know the European landowner group that you work with. And I feel like farmers around the world have more in common than they have that separate them. And I think that has been a valuable part of our collaboration as well. And the emphasis on soil health, I think, also unites us all around the world. So thank you, Mark. And just as a reminder to the audience, please put your questions in while his presentation is fresh in your mind, and we'll come back to some questions for him later. So next, I want to go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Tyler McCann. Tyler is Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. He spent almost a decade working in government, advising ministers, serving the Agriculture and Agri-Food Minister for most of that time. He has also worked as a consultant for farm groups, industry associations, and small and large agri-food businesses, advising on government relations, policy, and association management. Tyler also operates a beef and goat farm, which I had forgotten, Tyler, that there were goats on your farm in Western Quebec. So welcome, Tyler.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, for having me on. And we've always really appreciated the partnership with the Farm Foundation and our most recent partnership with our other colleagues in the Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation. And clearly, this is a timely topic. And it's worth highlighting from the beginning that the presentation that I'm going to give today is very different than the presentation I would have given had this forum been 3 weeks ago. And I really think I've got to kind of drill down on this, some what I think are some really basic things that have been forgotten from a trade perspective. And just like the Farm Foundation, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is a not-for-profit, non-partisan think tank interested in advancing policy solutions. But as much as we are non-partisan, the events that we've experienced over the last couple of weeks have really made us more strongly partisan, but partisan in favor of agriculture, partisan in favor of Canadian agriculture, and partisan in favor of agriculture trade and the benefits that it brings all of us. And so what I want to do is try and take my time today to talk mostly about my personal perspective on the trading relationship, the benefits of trade, what it brings, what it means to us all. And we'll wrap up with some thoughts on the GIFPI work and why that's really so important as we think and we move forward. But I really do need to start with what I think are some really important reminders. And I'm sure that, or I hope at least, that what I'm going to say to start my presentation off is not news to anyone participating in here. And hopefully there's broad agreement. And if there isn't, please, put your questions in and we can get into it after. But if you go to the next slide, and I'll say that again, this came together quickly as I watched what unfolded. But trade is a good thing, and I should have really written here at the beginning, rules-based trade is a good thing, because it really can help ensure we're on a level playing field, and that level playing field is really important. There are at times legitimate reasons for tariffs. Absolutely, we don't take away that. But if you look at how trade can help and how rules-based trade can help play a level playing field, it's really important to understand the facts. And we go back to things like, and I'm going to steal a couple of things, refer to the OECD work, and maybe pick up on some of the things Leanne will talk on a bit later. But if you look at the percent of gross farm receipts that government support offers over the last 5 years, but really over the last 10 years, it is really quite something how consistent and how close Canada and the United States are. So Canada is the red line on the graph. The United States is the blue line. We've heard a lot about kind of unfair subsidies in Canada and all of these things. But if you look at this objective measure of the support that a Canadian farmer receives versus the support an American farmer receives, we really are very closely connected. And that should mean that from that rules-based trade perspective, we're on a level playing field. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that goes on in the policy context that is different on both sides of the border. The dynamics are different. The dynamics are different around the world, and it's important really to kind of dig in and understand what's happening in those countries that are lower on that government support, and what's happening in those countries that are higher on that government level of support. But I want to drive home that we really are on a pretty level playing field in Canada and the United States. And so rules-based trade is a good thing. It helps ensure we're on a level playing field. But I don't think it's a level, I don't think it's fair to say or to think about that Canadian-American agriculture trade relationship as anything but level today. And if you go to the next slide, I want to try and highlight that it's also a two-way relationship, right? So one of the things that trade lets us do is build on each other's resources and advantages. So Canada relies on the United States for our phosphate fertilizer supply. About half of your exports come to Canada. It's about 95%, effectively all of the phosphate that we use. 54% of our nitrogen fertilizer comes from the United States. And because we're two very big countries, what we tend to see is in Eastern Canada and the Eastern United States, a north-south movement of goods back and forth. And in Western Canada and the Western United States, a north-south movement of goods back and forth. And so 80% of the potash needs that US farmers have, 40% of our production, 80% of your potash needs are being met by Canada. It's about 40% of the production that we have. 35% of our nitrogen exports are going to the United States. But what that fertilizer example I think really does is it helps show that this is a two-way trade that works both ways. This isn't something that's goods moving just south to north, and it isn't just Canadian resources going into the United States to add value, but it really is a two-way street. And a colleague from the Fertilizer Industry Association in Canada pointed out that while Canada may not be for sale, Canadian fertilizer is, and we hope to maintain that relationship. If you go to the next slide, just to drill down on how interconnected all of this is, right? This is an example where if you want to trace how that relationship looks across the border, let's start in Saskatchewan with potash. That potash is exported down to Iowa. Iowa farmers use that to grow corn. They then use that corn to feed pigs, but those pigs may have been born on a Manitoba farm, and Manitoba exports a large number of weanlings down into Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. Those hogs are fed out there and are slaughtered. And if you look at the hogs that are slaughtered in Minnesota and they're sent to consumers in the US and around the world, some of those hogs are going to consumers in Ontario. So you've got potash from Saskatchewan that's gone to Iowa, that's fed pigs that started in Manitoba and went to Minnesota. That pork fed consumers in Ontario, but those consumers in Ontario also bought $17 billion worth of agri-food products from the US as well. If you go to the next slide, this is something that the Canadian government has pulled together just to show how important Canada-US trade is to the United States. And if you want to find out more on this, the website is agr.gc.ca/agpartners. please go take time to look at it and find out more. If you go to the next slide, I will highlight that we have actually seen this reality where, from a processed food manufacturing perspective, we do have a trade surplus with the United States. We're well aware that this is something that's a primary cause for concern, one of the many causes of concern we've heard from the US administration. And we acknowledge that this is something that has changed in the last 5 years. If you look historically, Canada was really significantly at a trade deficit on agriculture and agri-food products with the United States, but we have seen this change. But again, these tend to be American businesses that are producing goods, or not necessarily just American, but global businesses producing for global markets out of Canadian operations. Often the Canadian plants are effectively niche plants. They're large plants in the Canadian context, probably a small plant in the American context, but they're able to produce niche goods that might not make sense in a large US plant. And I think ultimately we've seen this as something that really works for Canada, clearly works for Canada, but also works for the US, works for the businesses and the workers that are on both sides of the border. So we acknowledge that there's a trade surplus here, but I think it's really important to understand the context behind it. If you go to the next slide, it is, and again, these are numbers from the US government. And again, I'm hoping that everyone that's listening understands this, but it really, I want to highlight that trade is important to the United States too. And breaking up and trying to kind of reset the global trading agenda is going to have consequences. And if you look at, the percent of production of US farms that's going outside the borders of the United States, 60% of food grains, 50% of grains and oilseeds and milling products, 50% of oilseed products. If you look at the fruit and tree nuts that you're exporting, like your industry requires this and needs this. And so it was good to see, we really appreciated seeing some of those US farm groups starting and business associations starting to stand up and say over the last week that a trade war is not a good situation for the United States. So this is not a positive relationship for anyone involved at the end of the day. And by and large, the countries that have been talked about, that have been targeted, Europe, Canada, Mexico, we are fairly reliable trading partners, and that is a relationship that we should all value going forward. If you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight that breaking trade is a bad thing. And I know that there's been some discussion in the United States that what we've seen and the threat of tariffs wasn't about a trade war, it was about a drug war. I have to say, kind of, we've struggled to understand what that means in the Canadian context, because if you want to fight drugs and deal with legitimate health and safety issues from a drug perspective and a border perspective, tariffs won't fix that. Other actions will fix that. And what we saw on Monday was that effectively the government of Canada committed to things that it was doing anyways to address US concerns. But this is not something that it certainly has an impact on Canada. This is, we've felt this very strongly. It has brought Canadians together around this idea that there's a challenge there. But we also know that it's going to be bad for Americans too. And we really think that it's in all of our interests to find ways to avert this big challenge and this big breakdown in what has been a very reliable, safe, and meaningful trading relationship at the end of the day. If you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight what the government of Canada was going to do. And it's, Mark talked about some political instability in the European context. We're in a political instability in Canada as well. Our Prime Minister's signaled his intent to resign. The Liberal Party that he leads is going through a process to replace him. The polls have shown for some time that our opposition Conservative leader is likely to be the next Prime Minister. But across political parties and across these different leaders, across our different levels of government and business, there's been this real strong coming together of the need to offer a strong, meaningful, substantial response, and to not choose to take this without putting up a fight. And so what that fight would have looked like, based on the Prime Minister's announcement from last weekend, was an initial round of tariffs, 25% of tariffs on $30 billion worth of US imports. A lot of that was focused on agriculture and agri-food products. A second phase of an additional $125 billion worth of tariffs following a consultation period. There's a real effort, a real recognition to understanding that these retaliatory tariffs would have impacted Canadians. And so they wanted to take the time on that broader list to make sure that the impact on Canadians were being minimized and that we would put retaliatory tariffs on products that we could source other places. But beyond that threat of retaliatory tariffs, there was this real recognition that there were other things that we could do. So a lot of our provincially or government-owned liquor stores were pulling U.S. Wine and bourbon and other things off the store shelves. Governments were looking at how do you ban U.S. suppliers from Canadian procurement, and a real effort around Buy Canadian campaigns. And it was very grassroots. Canadians were looking at how do you better support Canadian businesses. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we've tried to do at CAPI is look at what are some things that we can do to make sure that we don't let this crisis go to waste? How do we use this as a wake-up call to say, look at the relationship that we valued for the last 30 years, really since the first free trade agreement was negotiated. That's been something that's been a real strategic asset for Canadian agriculture, isn't as reliable as it used to be. And so we've looked at putting forward suggestions like we need to really double down on resolving market access barriers in the rest of the world. We need to increase government funding, looking at trade diversification, new strategies, export promotion. We need to look at how do we reduce improve the competitiveness by reducing the tax burden, particularly carbon tax. It's been quite challenging. But also we need to look longer term. We need to look at how do we do a better job developing a more reliable trade infrastructure system. We need to look at how do we better collaborate with other partners that are facing these same challenges that we are as well. How do we look at diversifying away from U.S. imports? You know, we rely on the U.S. for farm inputs, like I talked about phosphate earlier, but also other pesticides, crop protection products. How do we look at changing how we do that business so that we're more insulated from the potential impacts? And really, at the end of the day, how do we look at building a stronger, more competitive, more innovative, more resilient agri-food system? And we've had the luxury of kind of taking our foot off the gas on these issues, and we can't let that happen anymore. So if you go to the next slide, I want to just finish with a couple of comments about the broader trade agenda. You know, the fundamentals aren't changing. Again, these are some OECD numbers. I really see those fundamentals as production is under pressure. Major food producers are going to be producing less likely in the future than they have before. We're seeing that challenge, you know, extreme weather, among many other things. We've got a smaller number of net exporters, but they're exporting more. Trade is going to continue to be incredibly important. And the sector is doing well on improving its environmental performance, but it can do better, and trade can play a role making sure that can happen. If you go to the next slide, just to highlight that one of the things that trade lets us do is move products from places where they can be produced sustainably, such as Canada, to places where they can be where they can't. And we need the systems. We need a sustainable trade system that recognizes that benefit and recognizes that need to do it. And so we need to think about how do we put that together. If you go to the next slide, I think that really highlights the work that GIFP is doing. And it's about how do you build that system at the end of the day. And I really think that the steps that were outlined in the report coming out of our Washington workshop next year just really are what I think common sense solutions that make sense that we should all be working on together. You know, the instability in the trade environment today is certainly needs to be addressed, but we shouldn't take away from this long-term solution going forward. So I will hand it back over to you, Sherry.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Really appreciate hearing a Canadian perspective today. I particularly liked the map that you showed of the ties from each state. I will also flag that the Council on Foreign Relations has some great charts like that. It says, you know, trade in 9 charts, and one of them was a different visualization of that, which I do think is critical. I also really like the pig flow chart, again, to show just how interconnected our agricultural systems really are, and that did a great job of sharing that. And last, I appreciated you kind of just touched on it briefly, but the comparative advantage theory that has kind of been a bedrock of our global trading system. I appreciated you flagging that today as well. So look forward to more conversations soon. And just again, as a reminder to the audience, go ahead and put your questions in as a reaction to Tyler's presentation while it's fresh in your mind. So next, I would like to introduce Katie McRobert. Katie is Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute. Katie has been part of the Australian Farm Institute team since late 2017, holding roles as Senior Researcher and General Manager before becoming the new Executive Director. Prior to joining AFI, Katie worked as a Global Content and Community Manager for Rabobank, liaising with farming clients to build knowledge banks, and as the National Editor for Farm Online, overseeing 7 digital rural news mastheads, including The Land and the Queensland Country Life. And Katie, we are all so grateful. You get the gold star, the double gold star for the time zone challenges. It's the middle of the night there. So just can't thank you enough for being with us, and look forward to hearing your thoughts today. Over to you.
Thank you, Sherry. And yes, please forgive me for reading off my notes. As Sherry said, it is absolutely the middle of the night. This is probably the worst time zone I've ever participated in, but very pleased to be part of this discussion today. It's an incredibly important one for Australia, for the rest of the world. So I'm very privileged to be part of this. If we can go to the next slide, I am going to start this presentation with some context about Australian agriculture. There will be no pop quiz at the end, so you don't have to take all of this in, but this context is really important for helping to explain what our interests are in this space. So how we use land is a really important one, because it's often assumed, even by a lot of Australians, I've got to say, that we have vast unused but usable space around Australia. We already use more than half the country for agricultural production, and as you can see from that diagram there, the vast majority of that is livestock grazing. If you're looking for the agricultural areas on the map there, the yellowish parts are ag production. If you have to squint, you can see there's tiny little red dots around the edges of the country. That's where most of our people are clustered. So you can drive for 5 or 6 hours between towns and see almost no people, even just in one state, or even longer. So it sort of feels like there's a whole lot of emptiness out there. But availability of land is actually a real pressure in Australia. Not all of that is arable. Our soils are very old, very fragile soils, and the climate can be very harsh in much of the country. So that's some context for the land. If we go to the next slide, our commodity mix is almost evenly split between livestock and cropping. If you're looking at the value of production, our gross value of production is rising, even though we've had some pretty serious climatic challenges, but our growth is stalling. In the 10 years to 2022-23, so the past most recent decade it's been measured, agricultural productivity growth, when it's adjusted for climate and weather effects, averaged just 0.13% per year, which was much lower than market sector productivity growth generally, which averaged 0.4% per year. Next slide, please. And of course, we are an export-focused country, which means we are trade exposed. We export 72% of the value of our agricultural production, and you can see the mix there across a range of commodities. This is very much front of mind for all Australian producers, whether or not they're in the export market. Personally, we're very much aware that trade is what underpins our agricultural economy. It also underpins a lot of our regional food security. Although Australia is a food secure country, we export a lot to our near neighbours as well. The export focus also means that demonstration of ESG compliance and proactive sustainability efforts is key to maintaining access to those markets. Next slide, please. So thinking about some of the policy problems that we're tackling at the moment, I'm going to quote almost directly from a colleague's article. We have similar to your USDA, our department would be called ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Ag Resource and Economics, and Jared Greenville, head of ABARES, has written an article for the Australian Farm Policy Journal that AFI publishes just recently, but of course ABARES has been doing an enormous amount of work in this space. So we are going quite well in Australian agriculture, but our success is definitely not assured. A large part of our success has been the ability to change in response to consumer and market conditions, and this has been enabled by our trade policy approaches and our domestic policy approaches as well. Being open to markets, being able to navigate market dynamics has really contributed also to our strong sustainability credentials, as well as that GVP success. And our exports have enjoyed lower tariffs in many export markets as a result of our free trade agreements built over time. The FTA benefits include better tariff and quota access for Australian exporters. From the late, say, 2010s onwards, our international competitors started to enjoy similarly low tariffs through their own FTAs. We don't see that We didn't see that pattern likely to change. As Tyler said, it would have been a different presentation if we'd done this a month ago. Once tariffs are at net zero, down at zero, though, there's nowhere else to go. So Australia needs to look for other avenues to enhance our competitive advantages. And as sustainability and other concerns in health and in biosecurity have been heightened with increased trade and increased climate change impacts, the rules that govern trade have been changing. And we've seen the emergence of these NTMs, non-tariff measures, and these can be both trade promoting when they build trust between consumers and suppliers, or they can be trade limiting if they create onerous compliance costs. Next slide, please. Now, Tyler's shown a graph on producer support estimate that looked different to mine because mine is a different time frame and shows different countries. But what I wanted to highlight here that, as Tyler mentioned before, rules-based trade has really benefited our agricultural sector. Our current success, despite our climate challenges, is really the result of a combination of innovative practice combined with macroeconomic reforms, such as floating the exchange rate, but microeconomic policy reforms relating to the removal of distortionary policies which sheltered some of our industries from market signals. So we're more resilient today, we're more responsive to those changing market conditions and more actively able to respond to emerging opportunities. It's worth recalling, though, that it's not that long ago that our sector was also highly protected, just like farmers around the world are today. The producer support estimate, excuse me, was 13% for Australia in 1986, and today that sits at 3%. Most of that is not provided through direct production. Well, none of it's provided through direct production subsidies. Most of the producer support we have is provided through risk management initiatives such as farm management deposits or income tax smoothing. Next slide, please. So the data from the World Trade Organization that our colleagues from ABARES have been putting together from WTO and from the UN Conference on Trade and Development indicates the number of NTMs across all commodities has been increasing over time. The effect on these NTMs on agricultural trade could be significant. The recent analysis done by ABARES shows that by 2022, NTMs had an effect on Australian agricultural export quantities equivalent to an average of 19% tariff. This stands significantly high when the average applied tariff into Australia's top 10 agricultural export markets is only 1%, and the global average tariff sits around 5%, or it did up until quite recently. But caution is still required when you're interpreting these tariff equivalent estimates. These results don't suggest that prices rise on 19%, rather they refer to a tariff that would cause the same change in trade. So they could have a different influence on trade compared to a direct tariff as NTMs affect behavior across the supply chain. Different players in the supply chain are going to respond differently to the way that an exporter responds to a tariff. But notwithstanding those caveats, these could represent a multi-billion-dollar burden on Australian agricultural exports over time, and they warrant concerted and strong efforts to pay attention to what's happening in this space of non-tariff measures. And carbon leakage, which I think my colleagues have also referred to as well, is a very big concern for Australia. We don't want to be seeing one group of producers penalised for doing things sustainably and then just exporting the sustainability problem to somebody else. Next slide, please. So the Australian ag industry has been aware of these many different pressures for some time, and the impact of climate change for Australian farmers is not a future problem. Yields and profits are already being impacted. Volatility is quite clearly increased, and certainly our financiers are very nervous. To help make sense of all of this and help focus activity and resources across the industry, we at the AFI have been working on the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework since 2021. The development of this framework has been led by the National Farmers Federation, which is our peak advocacy group for farmers, and it's been funded by our Department of Agriculture funded by our Department of Agriculture. So the current iteration of this framework identifies 17 overarching principles. My apologies, those are quite small, but you can Google it and you can see these in more detail so you can read them more directly. But those 17 overarching principles of sustainability set out that desired outcome or ideal state that we'd like to see the industry move to or be at. And they're underpinned by currently 43 criteria, which are conditions that you'd need to meet for that principle to be upheld. And the AFI is now working on indicators and identification of nationally relevant metrics. The AASF is deliberately presented in this continuum style to reiterate that there's no ranking hierarchy to these different goals, these different overarching principles. All of these are part of a spectrum and they're very strongly connected, and you can't really separate one from the other. Soil health is directly connected to landscape management, directly connected to biodiversity, and of course, same with the social and governance aspects of the framework. The intention with the AASF is not to enforce compliance across the industry, but to improve consistency and recognition of shared sustainability principles in agriculture, not just in Australia, but hopefully beyond, because by clearly communicating the sustainability status and goals of Australian ag, this work hopes to enable us to maintain that access to competitive financial products, to maintain or improve our market access, and also to help farmers to future-proof their own enterprises and protect natural capital by seeing clearly articulated what those goals look like. Next slide, please. This more complex one, you don't have to read, I'm going to just talk through it, is just to illustrate that we are not quite ready yet. We feel like we're ready because we've done a lot of work, or some of us feel ready and some of us don't. The AASF itself is still a project, and it's not a reporting tool, it's a guidance framework. The market and regulators are already demanding evidence of ESG compliance, and Australian agribusinesses display a pretty wide range of maturity or readiness, from already reporting on these things and having their own internal processes in place to not even quite seeing the value of what any of this means to them. A lot of people are quite confused about their responsibilities for this kind of reporting. They're also confused about the options and what the benefits or the penalties are. We actually don't have national standards yet for GHG reporting in Australian agriculture. Next slide, please. So investment in agricultural supply chain traceability has been a big focus of the Australian government, partly because of this confusion that we're seeing as well. One example of this is the AgTrace project, which is also funded by the Department of Ag, and the development of the AATP, or Australian Agricultural Traceability Protocol, which is based on the UNTP, or United Nations Transparency Protocol, which is a project set to digitize industry mechanisms to simplify existing processes to enable a tell us once approach. Strong evidence-based credentials and data are really needed to meet those emerging requirements and to support the claims of product integrity, of animal welfare, of environmental sustainability, and to remain competitive in an increasingly complex international trading environment. And we need this kind of these new tech approaches to also help us transfer that information easily without putting an extra burden on farmers, and to use that information for multiple purposes to improve efficiency, data quality, to help us with pricing accuracy, better biosecurity tracing, lower the compliance burden, hopefully, and also underpin that social license. Next slide, please. So zooming back out again, there is obviously plenty of activity in Australia around the ways that we define sustainability, how we manage our trade policy, how we track and trace the attributes and measures of our success. And this all comes back to the twin pressures on land and on exports. Our land resources are finite. The pressure to use land differently in a decarbonised economy is likely to trigger structural change. We need better ways to measure our current footprints and impacts in agriculture, both positive and negative, to make good long-term decisions for sustainable productivity, not only in Australian agriculture, but in our region. And we operate in this ever-changing global economy, and trade policies have a really big impact on our sector, including on our practice choices. Policies which fail to account for regional differences in ecology, climate, or practice could have some pretty serious unintended consequences. Globally, I think we spend around $611 billion a year in what we would label as trade and production distorting agricultural support. So reforming these distortions is a really important consideration in considering what sustainable trade policy looks like. Like subsidies, those non-tariff measures could trigger some perverse outcomes by affecting behaviours across supply chains. Next slide, please. So the participants in the July 2024 workshop we ran for GIFBI brought some really great insights to the table, and some of the quotes in the paper that we produced really jumped out at me as resonating with Australian agriculture, and they were about keeping those markets open, about encouraging innovation to enable sustainable growth, allowing for flexibility in regional approaches, and avoiding those unintended consequences. And last slide, please. So we do, as my colleagues have highlighted, live in interesting times. We are in this together. There are many obstacles, though, in front of us, and fear and insularity are real problems. The factors exacerbating climate change and agricultural insecurity don't respect borders or political positions. We, as a group, this group that's on this call today, need to take ownership of building those kinds of frameworks that can support sustainable international agricultural trade. Trade policy is not the silver bullet for sustainable agricultural productivity, but it certainly can be a key enabler. And I'm very pleased to see so many people interested in hearing more about this and hopefully working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, so much for those insights. I've really appreciated learning more through the Australian sustainability framework that has been part of our collaboration, where that allowed me to learn more about that. And your presentation certainly shows that sustainability pressures are not going away for Australian farmers and producers. So I think that's still a core theme that I heard throughout. I do want to check in, Katie, before we move on. I know your intention was to stay with us throughout today's presentation. Are you still able to stay with us?
I'm good. Had some
Thank
coffee.
you for your commitment and really appreciate it. Thanks, Katie. So with that, we'll move to our next presenter. Devri Bufner-Vorwerk is our next speaker, and Devri is known as a global C-suite food executive and corporate officer, having served as Chief Communications Officer and Global Head of Corporate Affairs at Cargill and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Grubhub. She is also a sustainability entrepreneur, founding Devri B Sustainable Strategies, her own strategy and advisory company, and served on the advisory boards of Culinary Sciences, Inc. and Agrology. Devri is an international business development and diplomacy strategist, as well as an expert in international trade relations, demonstrated by her success as a senior policy advisor at Akin Gump, leader in international and regional corporate affairs roles at Cargill, and in roles at the U.S. International Trade Commission, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the World Bank Group. And I know we're doing a little pivot for you to do your own slides, but with that, over to you.
Let me know.
Thank you for being here.
I'm going to share my screen and let me know when you can see it, because I won't be able to see myself necessarily. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
And I'm going to pull it up into slide mode. Good middle of the night, good afternoon, good evening. It's a delight to be with such esteemed colleagues from around the world. Noticing who all's on the telephone, I would say we've got the best of the best in terms of people who know and understand what's happening at the intersection of trade and sustainability and can do something about it. I wanted to quickly start by saying many of you know me in the context of, oh, there goes Devri. She knows a lot about trade policy, a lot about ag trade policy, and about 5.5 years ago, I made a pivot to step out of my corporate role to found a company on sustainability and ESG. A really bad word, ESG. And a lot of folks were confused by that. But as I present this this slide deck, you'll begin to see where the convergence took place and why I felt it was important to step out and found a company, especially one that can focus on small and mid-sized enterprises in the supply chain. Because that is where we see the biggest gap in terms of and also the greatest pressure, where the larger organizations like the one that I was a part of at Cargill for 15 years marched toward building out an integrated what I would call sustainability framework that gave us our license to operate. The larger players kind of started to figure that out, but yet it turns to the small and mid-sized enterprises, and especially the farmers, to say, okay, here's how we're doing it and here's how we're complying. Yet the investment's not there, and sometimes the in-house resources are not there. So for many of you, I want to just kind of maybe I'm feeling a little inadequate in terms of my trade resources. So I'm just going to let you know the things that kind of ground me in my thinking. I always have a copy of James P. Houck on my desk, which is the Elements of Agricultural Trade Policy. Now, it wouldn't be complete unless in here there was never the tariff rate quota, because that didn't come in until we started in mass during the Uruguay round. So if you need a good refresher, here's my thesis from Cornell on the tariff rate quota. And I know my colleague from OECD is here. And I was fortunate enough to be able to spend time as a grad student figuring out how we integrated TRQs and modeling of that into our thinking. And then, of course, the legal text of the Uruguay round. Now, I haven't had to update this because we haven't had a fresh round, global trade round, in a long time. So I'm saying this all in jest so that you don't understand where I'm coming from. And I want to mention, I was sitting here thinking, gee, this is a historical conversation given the moment in time. And Mark, you talked about how Europe wants to make sure they work with like-minded countries as it relates to the new vision on ag coming out of Europe and trade, but that market access can be a tool. Tyler, I really appreciate you updating your deck to reflect what's happening and go back to remind us all of the importance of trade from the Canadian perspective. And then Katie, you pointed something out that's been angst for me for a long time, which is this, reminding folks of the subsidy structures and how, the drawing down and the inclination we had to draw down some of these subsidies and make commitments in the WTO allowed the market to come in and actually make a long-term resilient competitive marketplace for farmers and for the industry. You pointed out these non-tariff measures, which are sneaky, is what I call them, or what maybe you said that, but I was saying, like, these are actually where we're having some of the challenges as it relates to sustainability. So I'm going to just, from our perspective, tell you how we talk with our clients about sustainability, because we get the first question, well, what is it? And for us, it's about sitting down with our clients and talking to them about taking accountability of both the positive and negative externalities that a business creates, and finding a way to document those, because society cares about it, our communities care about it, our employees care about it, the business leaders themselves care about it, and then finding ways to mitigate the negative impacts. Now, ESG is a framing, and Katie kind of mentioned that, as we talk about it as a risk management tool. If a company or a farmer or an industry comes together and says, okay, we understand all of these particular material issues, and we begin to start to categorize those and measure against those and report against those and review them and maybe change some of our practices and then verify those, that's how we describe ESG. Now, one thing I want to point out, and this is where these NTMs are coming in, right, as it relates to expectations from different market players and countries. This report that the Farm Foundation has done in 2024 does point out that there's limited understanding of that. And when there's limited understanding of what sustainability is, allowing the marketplace to work that out becomes quite difficult, because consumers are confused. Even producers are confused as to what the standards are and what the real benefits are that come out of it. I raise it because I want to provide some understanding of how we think about this and how we begin to frame it at the very, at the farm level and at the business level. And we use this with our clients, talking about being good stewards financial stewards of their business, and also stewards of people and nature, and bringing, at the business level, the conversation together around what we call the shared issue stack. And ultimately, that issue stack becomes a broader national issue stack, an international issue stack that we have to negotiate. But this is how we really ground our clients in thinking through, well, what does sustainability mean for us? And we help our clients through what I did for many years, trying to do this across 70 geographies in my leadership role at Cargill with my colleagues over a 15-year period, helping the company begin to anticipate all of the issues in the supply chain, the environmental, the social, and the governance issues, and trying to bring that all together in a way that we could build mechanisms, approaches, processes, even new business lines to address those, and then communicate that, because a huge part of getting a license to operate is to communicate more broadly to the stakeholders that care about it. And then where can we lead? Where can we step into conversations around, making a difference in these areas? So at the center of all of it is what we call our guiding principle of truth, which means it's very difficult sometimes to stare in the mirror as a business leader, as a farmer, as a processor, even as a legislator or regulator, and say, gee, the way we've been doing it needs to change, right? And so then we have to go through that whole process of what does that change look like? So I wanted to give you that context so you understood that indeed I am at my, origin focused on trade, because it is something that facilitates opportunity, and I'm going to get to our collective purpose here. But also sustainability is we have to acknowledge that a sustainable system, a sustainable ag system, is important. So let's get grounded on sustainable trade. I'm going to quickly give you a brief description of what I think our unified purpose is here today and going forward. A brief history through my lens, through the DevRe lens, so that you can get an understanding from a practitioner level of how I'm seeing it, and where we then begin to traverse this moment where the ground is shifting under our feet. And then how do we re-engage in some global platforms on trade and sustainability? I'm elevating the conversation on trade. So first of all, getting us grounded in unified purpose. I use this all on stages anytime I give a speech, because it's something that grounds me, but it's also something that grounds, I'm coming at you all from sort of the American perspective. Take a minute to read this. I believe in the future of agriculture, with a faith born not of words, but of deeds, achievements won by present and past generations of agriculturalists, in the promise of better days through better ways, even as the better things we now enjoy have come to us from the struggles of former years. Take a minute to breathe that in. Do you see yourself in this? Many of you will raise your hand and say, yes, I can even, cite it without even looking at the words. But this comes from the National FFA Creed here in the United States, the Future Farmers of America. And it's the first paragraph. And the reason I use it around the world is to break divides. Many of our leaders here in the United States, our new Secretary of Agriculture comes out of the FFA. And I'm a former member, and many of us who have been engaging in farming and engaging in the global dialogue have committed to this creed. This creed, I believe, transcends geographies. We all here today believe in the future of agriculture. And we know it's been difficult, and we know that we can get better days through better ways, and I've placed that as green to note the sustainability component. So what's our shared purpose globally? Let us not forget that each day when we begin to engage in our livelihoods and our businesses, we're centered on this: zero hunger, ending hunger to achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. It's this component here, sustainable agriculture, that's creating the fuzziness, the difficulty, the confusion, and the challenges in our supply chain, because it's not a harmonized understanding. But we're not going to disagree that we know that as an industry globally, we unite around this, which is every day seeking that opportunity to figure out how we're going to feed those who don't have access to the right kinds of calories, sufficient number of calories, affordable calories. So in our commitment together as a global industry, we're looking at two areas pop up: prevent ag trade distortions and market distortions and export subsidies, and also do it sustainably. Here is our challenge. So the FAO just put a report out at the end of 2024 that links trade to hunger, and I thought that was really astute to begin to just elevate that conversation again and give us some data and some tools to speak with those who are in a position on public policy, for them to need to understand this direct link. So if we can all just take a deep breath in this moment and understand that Our arguments haven't changed. The imperative hasn't changed. And actually the tool of trade and the importance that trade brings to addressing the end to hunger hasn't changed. So we need to stay grounded in that and then figure out how we navigate the landscape. But before we do that, I want to give us some tools from history. I always like to use this slide to remind folks when they say, where did ESG and sustainability come from anyway? And this comes from Thomson Reuters, who has a lot of good information out on ESG. But I like to say, look, from kind of the beginning of modern time, we've had the expectation that business and governments carry out their roles and regulate business such that we can assure ourselves that whatever we're putting in our mouths or providing to our families or using as products and services does not harm us and does not harm the environment and allows us to have a resilient planet Earth going forward. And so this is kind of the marching forward of some of the beginnings and also some of that that momentum that started to create the modern sustainability and ESG era. And I'm going to point out too here, when the Rockefeller Foundation started to launch, there was actual money and funds that went behind beginning to put the standards around sustainability and principles around responsible investment. It started to accelerate. And when Mike Bloomberg came in and gathered a bunch of CEOs, especially as I recall my CEO at the time, around a table to say, look, let's come up with something like some accountability. And they created the Sustainability Accountability Standards Board in 2009 and started to collect data, and businesses started to measure against that. That's when the momentum really took hold. And I want to back up, because this is, as the ESG and sustainability movement and responsible investment movement is going, the trade rounds were also happening at the same time. And remember, the 1994, we had the creation of the WTO and the conclusion of that trade round. And this is, I like to say, such a monumental point in history when Devery hits Washington, right? Beginning, my first job was at the World Bank to work with developing country negotiators on implementing that round. And starting to, understand the USITC and the USTR. I started traveling the world, understanding tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. And that was where my first inclination of remember the word multifunctionality, and interviewing the European, regulators at the time and understanding, well, gee, these are non-tariff barriers to trade, but they were very tied to the how they wanted to produce or how they wanted their system to work. So trade was running right alongside all of the advancement in the ESG and sustainability. And then the Doha development round begins. And we, at the same time after that, I enter the private sector and get a completely new view and begin trying to figure out how we're going to use trade and, new apparatuses like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the implementations of NAFTA, and how are we going to engage in the WTO and make sure that we get this Doha round going. I mean, it was all swirling around at the same time. And the first thing I can, I think about, in the private sector, where the merging of the expectations on social and environment and governance really started to take hold with the trade agenda, was when, during the Hong Kong round, right across the street from my office was Oxfam, who was working very closely with the least developed countries to ensure that their voices were heard in that round. And if you were in Hong Kong for those 11 days, you would see the division between the how things get done, the expectations we have versus just the standard trade agenda around market access subsidies and export, subsidies. Really, in my mind, I started to realize the power of the activists and setting the expectations on trade in the supply chain. And actually, it was in 2006 when Greenpeace climbed an elevator in Santarém, Brazil, at the time when I was at Cargill, starting to set expectations on our supply chain and deforestation on our soy supply chain. So all of it started coming together at the same time. And then from 2006 onward, it was the unprecedented activism that was successful, where companies and corporate brands were starting to grapple with, it's not just trade, it's how we trade. And we would see across blocks of, Central America and other countries, the same bits of legislation popping up that were setting increased expectation on supply chains. And so in 2008, the food price spikes hit. That was the first time that global industry came together around something called the New Vision on Agriculture, where we had all stakeholders at the table saying, how are we actually going to bring trade and what I would say is the modern day sustainability together to work for the entire global industry. And that's the WEF New Vision. And then really where this is taking hold and where it's playing out today is at the Consumer Goods Forum, and all the branded companies started stepping in and saying, look, we've got to figure out a way to address all these things to get our license to operate. And then in 2010, the FAO came up with climate smart, idea where it's, okay, we are going to now begin looking at these challenges that farmers are facing around the world, and also begin to integrate that in to their ability to produce for their own systems, but also supply around the world. And as we know, the Doha development round failed in 2020, 2013. And then we're starting to see, this is where the trade agenda shift. People are asking, is the WTO even relevant? And now everything shifts over to the climate negotiations, and the trade negotiations kind of muddled along. And at the same time, the climate negotiations were taking hold, the Sustainable Development Goals were taking hold. And then you're starting to see in 2017, companies really come in and put some of their money behind investing in climate action. So I bring this up because let's just take it from 2015 to the last 10 years. This is a good representation of what's happened over the last 10 years at company levels and also at industry levels. Is from the brands themselves. The pressure's been coming from the brands because they're consumer facing. They want to also make sure they're complying with regulations all around the world. And also the retailers have been in charge. And so you're starting to see that this is, the data has been coming together, and then all of the different focus areas to meet these expectations of the climate agenda and at the same time, the trade agenda. So it has been all about the brands driving this, and it's still about the brands driving this today. But it's been basically what I would describe over the last 20 years, a sustainability, trade, and ESG climate agenda tornado. And this is what business has been up against. And this is what all industry, I just want to stop and breathe and say, look, congratulate ourselves as an industry that we've been able to navigate all of this at the same time in order to continue trade flowing and continue, growing our businesses, advancing our license to operate around the world, and at the same time seeking enhanced investment in innovation, supply chains, and also trying to bring the appropriate science to the table, the research to the table, what I want to say is sort of the next generation of leaders to the table, et cetera. It's been a tornado. Yes, you can recognize that. So how do we traverse this moment? I'm going to talk about a few different areas that I want to kind of raise, which is the obvious. There's scrutiny right now on ESG, climate, and trade at the legislative levels. Here in the United States, we're tracking across even states some anti-ESG type bills that are going, across the U.S. A lot of it is focused on the S and DEI, but also a lot of the environmental innovation and investment and collaboration that's been taking hold could be collateral damage. There's shareholder scrutiny on ESG, judicial scrutiny, regulatory scrutiny, and as we know in the last 3 weeks, administrative scrutiny. I want to pluck out that trade element because trade is now being used as a tool to combat all kinds of different issues that the new administration wants to see addressed. Green hushing is taking place. I use this as a term that my colleague Thomas Crampton from my YGL class at the World Economic Forum is using. You're seeing a lot of companies go, oh, are they really retrenching? like Unilever came out and changed, has kind of changed its organizations of sustainability, or are they just hushing down so that they don't become a target? It's yet to be seen. It's a bit of both, I believe. And I do believe across the corporate space, there's a lot of assessment and analysis of where they go forward, where they stop, and maybe actually where they might want to go backward. Trade is propping up sustainability at the moment. It has the ability to do that. There's a lot of conversation around, well, in Europe, we're going to have these provisions and they're going to be carbon border adjustments. But I would also say it could be, Mark, you mentioned, coming out with some new directives on the vision for ag, et cetera. This could also be part of creating a trade war. And so we have to be mindful as an industry that some of these non-tariff measures that come up could actually create a trade war. The Commission has said that they are going to simplify, hurrah, recognition that it's just a lot coming at business to be able to navigate all of these competing standards as it relates to trade flowing across borders. Standards convergence will be a huge issue. This is something my colleague Katie Galloway put together in terms of how to navigate it. She's put an article out yesterday on this for businesses. This is how you navigate the sustainability landscape globally. And where you're trying to bring it all together. I would submit that actually it's the ISSB. I can see it in my mind as clear as day. Business wants clear harmonization, just like we did on food safety with the Global Food Safety Initiative. I would submit there's going to be greater prominence of the ISSB, and that's where the ag community globally needs to pay attention, because the brands are behind this. Again, the brands that I talked about as it relates to Consumer Goods Forum behind it. The carbon vacuum will continue, and measurement's going to be a very important piece of that. Measuring carbon footprints at the small farm, large farm, business level is important, because the carbon economy is not going away. I'm not trying to make a promo. So Mark, I would also add in here that I'm on the board of Agrology. I've pointed that out as a key for measurement. Mark is here also from Indigo Ag and others. We cannot move backward, because it's going to be important to demonstrate our carbon footprint as we move things across borders. Yesterday, there was something in the Washington Post by Cass Sunstein talking about the social cost of carbon. As an industry, we need to begin looking at that. There's kind of regulated social costs of carbon in California with CARB, or even in New Zealand and Australia, and in the European Commission. But this is going to be something really important for us to pay attention to, is the carbon economy and how that will incentivize or de-incentivize progress on sustainable ag. I made this up last week or 2 weeks ago when I was presenting at Cornell's Ag Outlook. I was just thinking, look, I do believe there's going to be a moment now where we take a look at a lot of the allocation, maybe misallocation of funds that have gone into all kinds of potential sustainable investments. And we will see kind of a colander, like the ones that are truly adding to the long-term outcomes of a sustainable industry versus those that might be nice projects. I X'd out climate to be provocative. I don't want any one of us to get lost in language. If climate smart is not a language that's working, conservation, stewardship, these kinds of resilience, these kinds of things, economic resilience, farmer resilience, let's not lose sight. We don't need to divide with language. And we also don't need to give in on the fact that we're facing a climate crisis. But let's be thoughtful about how we describe what we need in terms of the outcomes. Last, aid and trade. I'm putting this out here because as an ag community, aid has facilitated trade. We are a huge part of the aid equation, and this is something that is in the bullseye. And I would submit that we need to come together with a very strong voice as the ag community in the United States and as a global ag community. It's okay to stand up for aid and how we get that aid administered. But we're in a pretty dark day right now as it relates to our partners. I served on the board of a nonprofit that was working with farmers all around the world, and been on the front lines between the country of Georgia and Russia, where we've been able to administer aid. They have a George Bush highway in terms of our ability to build out a resilient economy there, and an economy that really appreciates the relationship with the United States. So a few things that I want to highlight is we need to maintain global platforms on trade. 0.0, not even 0.1. We have the ability as an industry to maintain commercial diplomacy with all these markets, regardless of what our governments are doing. If they're spatting with one another, we engage our governments, but we also engage our customers. So I would submit that we will be needing to do more trade delegations together as it relates to serving our customers in these global markets. Next, farmers first. I put a diverse view of farmer. Farmer is not a homogenous term. We need to engage our farmers, bring our farmers to the table, and make sure that our farmers are part of the conversation around trade. And I know we've done that in the past, and I commend the Farm Foundation for doing it today. We will be stepping this up, this engagement. It's on all of us to make sure we have diverse voices, and those who are on the front lines of providing sustainable food to be at the table, prescribing some of the solutions. This is WTO is not dead. I've pulled up the latest committee review here. I'm encouraged that we actually still have a platform to discuss this. We need to reinvigorate what we've already got, which is a global framework. Let me say this again. WTO is not dead. Let me say it again. WTO is not dead. Thinking about having delegations go over, we did it in the past. We need to continue to do it. We need to continue to engage. And other key forums where we can continue to land and lift these conversations. I'm a big believer in going into portals. APEC, South Korea is hosting it this year. I see very little participation and coordinated participation from the global ag community in APEC. Give me a call. I'm a Pacific Economic Cooperation Council advisor. It would be really important in this moment in time to have coordinated agriculture delegations. That's 21 Asia Pacific governments that we can engage all at the same time. ASEAN, there's others. We need to be searching for these key forums and make ourselves present on trade. Yes, and sustainability is there, but we're not going to discuss the climate negotiations as much as they are enveloped in the trade negotiations. So my final considerations for compatibility of trade and sustainability. Let's ask ourselves these questions. Can we continue to stay grounded and take the long view as a global industry? Tick, yes, we can, if we work together. Can we re-up our commitments to a trade architecture? Tick, yes, we can. We've done it before, we can do it again. Can we work toward a harmonized set of standards in sustainability? Tick, we can do it. These take long drawn out fights over really, really nuanced issues, but we can do it. Can we transcend politics of the time to advance good policy? Tick, we can. One of my heroes is Clayton Yiter. And we all know the Blair House Accord and how he was able to transcend politics to set us on a good path. Will we invest in it? Will we invest in our farmers, in the innovation and in agriculture? Tick, we are. We are investing. We have invested. So let's not go down the road of despair. Let's lift our heads up and decide our fate. So I will stop there. And do I need to stop sharing?
Yes, we'll pivot over back to
Thank you.
our Katie, and she will start driving the slides next. But thank you, Debbie. I especially appreciated you shining the light on the supply chain and the corporate and branding issues, the role of language. There's a lot of richness there. I think we'll come back to the WTO discussion in our group discussion. And Farm Foundation is a fan of Clayton Yiter too. He was heavily involved at Farm Foundation, and as a Nebraska schoolgirl, I went to school with his kids too growing up.
Excellent.
So appreciate your reference to Clayton as well. So while the slides are already back up. Great, thank you, Katie. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Leanne Jackson, and thank you for being our grand finale today, Leanne. Dr. Jackson is the head of Agro-Food Trade and Market Division in the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Based in Paris, she leads the work examining the links between policies and outcomes on food and agricultural markets, including specific analysis related to modeling medium-term outlook for commodity markets, understanding policies from a food systems perspective, and enhancing the transparency and predictability of agricultural trade. She has over 20 years of experience working in the area of trade and agriculture, including 16 years working at the WTO, where she served as the Secretary to the Committee on Agriculture, advising WTO member countries on issues related to agricultural trade policy and multilateral negotiations. Thanks so much for joining us today, Leanne, and it's your turn. So look forward to your insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And it's a little daunting to be the last speaker after that round of speakers, where I found myself taking notes and seeing linkages with all of the things that I'm going to be talking about too. So hopefully for the audience, you can also see the linkages. And I'm so appreciative of being able to be a part of this kind of conversation, especially in this moment, which feels quite disruptive for everyone. And I think all of us are looking to find constructive narratives about the way forward, a way to be able to continue to talk about sustainability and trade at the same time. So could I have the next slide, please? I'm not sure everyone on the call knows what the OECD does, so I'll just do a quick introduction. OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and here I really put the emphasis on cooperation. We're working with our 38 member states around the world to do research to inform policymakers' decision-making. And we do that through a range of activities covering a huge range of topics, including food and agriculture. So as you heard, I work in the agriculture area and I lead the work on agri-food trade and markets. We produce data and analysis and insights for our members. We convene our members together to try to have constructive discussions across differences and to think about best practices that could be mutually agreeable across the different members in the OECD. And we also have a set of work that's around setting standards and recommendations. And again, the key here is around the cooperation. Every publication that we produce has to be declassified through a country-led discussion. So all the research that I'll put in front of you in the next few slides is research that's already gone through our committee or our working party, where we have delegations from our different members telling us where they want us to message and how they want us to find these sort of tricky negotiated messages, right? Because even if OECD is considered like-minded and that sort of a group of countries that are relatively similar, of course, we know, those of us on the call know that there are differences, of course, across the membership. So we spend a lot of time working with our delegates. We have network meetings where we try to share the different scientific methods that countries are using, to share the way that countries are trying to assess their own policies, so that then countries can kind of learn from each other about where the best practice is. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'll just quickly go through some data that we collect. So I'm coming at this from the OECD angle, which is global overview of data. So I want to throw up a few slides that resonate with messages you've already heard from previous speakers, including Devri, talking about what our collective global objectives are. And then I just wanted to highlight 3 areas that we've been tracking recently around policy developments and evolution over time. So the first one is related to how countries are thinking about investing in sustainable productivity. The second one is work that we've been doing on tracking environmental outcomes along supply chains. So again, this resonates with themes that you've been hearing. And then the last one is to give you a quick overview of what we've been doing. We did a stock take recently looking at trade measures that countries are taking at the border to influence environmental outcomes of their trading partners. And then I'll just wrap up with a little bit on opportunities and challenges. Maybe just before, well, that's fine. We can stay on this slide. Just to note that we've had a lot of moments where the narrative around food systems has really come into global dialogues. So we had a couple of years ago at COP28, there was a declaration on food systems, which referenced the importance of rules-based trade. We've had declarations in different global forums like the G7 and the G20 and APEC, which also highlight the importance of thinking about what it takes to have robust systems. Even at the OECD, a few years ago, we had a ministerial where this issue of transforming food systems in order to be able to achieve these big global objectives and to achieve them sustainably was highlighted. And one of the issues around this framing is we know that agriculture is meant to do a bunch of things, including feeding the world, including providing livelihoods for farmers and for other stakeholders and workers along food supply chains. And more, as we've heard, we're expecting agriculture and food systems to do this all sustainably. And the question that OECD is asking is, okay, what are the policy levers that need to be put in place or maybe need to be removed in order to create these incentives so that they align, so that we can actually get a systems transformation? Because when you have such a complex system, sometimes it's hard to get it to move off of where it sits in an equilibrium. So how do you get those incentives to align? This slide is just a reminder that we have been working through the Sustainable Development Goals to try to achieve zero hunger, and Deborah had a slide on this just a few minutes ago. We're not on track. And this slide shows 20 years of data where you can see that over the first 15 years, or kind of leading up to the moment where we had COVID, there was an improvement in terms of decline in the number of undernourished people globally. But since COVID, we've seen an uptick in the number globally, and the proportion of the global population that is the global prevalence of undernourishment, which is the right-hand side of this graph. And it hasn't really improved substantially since that uptick. Could I have the next slide, please? Just to pick up on some of the work that OECD has been doing about trends in agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, just flagging this sort of climate and sustainability angle. This slide can be a little bit tricky to understand. It reflects data that we produce collectively with the FAO every year. So every year, the OECD and FAO produce a publication called the Agricultural Outlook, which is a 10-year projection of agricultural commodity markets. So we take data from the previous 3 years, and then we project them based on trends and data that we've collected into the future, not trying to predict the future, but rather to say, if nothing else changed, if the policy settings and the demographic trends stay the way they are, this is what we expect from global markets in the future. So what this graph is showing is a combination of, by region, how regions are experiencing their annual change in production. So that's the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, you have the annual change in greenhouse gas emissions. And that dotted line is basically where the annual change in greenhouse gas emissions is the same as the annual change in production. So the good news from this slide is that all those bubbles, which represent greenhouse gas emissions from different regions of the world, they're all below that line, which means that greenhouse gas emission intensity is expected to decline over the next 10 years. But actually, we still expect it to grow. So we expect direct emissions from agriculture to continue to grow by 5% up over the next 10 years. And one of the research pieces that we did a couple of years ago was to ask the question, what would it take in terms of a productivity increase for agriculture to both allow the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, so to eliminate hunger, while also simultaneously achieving the Paris Agreement goals of greenhouse gas emissions? And when we ran these scenarios, we got a number of, it would require a 28% increase in productivity. And just to put that into context, that would be almost twice, or a little bit more than twice, what we've actually experienced in terms of productivity growth in the previous decade. So it's a very big number. And the question that we're asking in a lot of our research at the OECD now is, what does it take to have sustainable productivity growth? So to continue to have productivity, but to do it using less inputs. Could I have the next slide, please? This slide is just a reminder that we've been hearing throughout this webinar. Trade plays a really key role in ensuring food security. So what this graph shows is the difference across regions in the import share of total consumption by region. So here you can see the diversity across North America, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Northeast and North Africa. And it also shows you the difference, the sort of size across the regions. So you can see North America imports are a small share of total consumption, but if you look at Near East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, well, particularly Near East and North Africa, it's quite a large proportion, and it's expected to increase over the next 10 years. So when we're thinking also a bit about global stability and the dynamics of population and needing to move food around the world in a fluid way, this graph, I think, also highlights the real key importance of having well-functioning global markets and rules-based trade. And we've heard that. Our research with FAO estimates that about 20% of all calories consumed are traded. So it's really important that we keep this system working. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to move now into the areas where we've looked at different policy developments, the three areas being sustainable productivity growth, carbon footprint measurement, and these trade-related measures associated with environmental outcomes. Could I have the next slide? So this graph shows research that we've put together tracking total factor productivity. So total factor productivity in agriculture is, as you know, total outputs divided by total inputs. And as inputs decrease, therefore, we see total factor productivity increasing. And this is a classic measurement that ag economists have been using for decades. What we see in this graph is that it's highlighting 3 periods of total factor productivity growth. If you look at the middle decade, which is the decade from 2000 to 2010, total factor productivity growth during that period was 1.6% per year. And if you look on to the right of that, the subsequent decade, total factor productivity growth is half of that. So we're not seeing productivity growth in agriculture increasing in the way that we would expect we would need it to increase. And simultaneously, we're seeing some mixed outcomes in terms of the environmental outcomes from agriculture. So we see, like I mentioned a minute ago, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, even though the intensity from agriculture is expected to decline. We are seeing some nutrient balances improving, but we're seeing biodiversity in many instances worsening. And this is globally. So I recognize, of course, that in different parts of the world, these numbers are going to look different. But just to capture this idea that we're both concerned about productivity growth, and we're concerned about what the impacts of agriculture are on these different environmental indicators. Several of the previous speakers have talked about the OECD's monitoring of support to agriculture. So we've been doing that since the 1980s. And support to agriculture is sort of a bundle of subsidies, so direct payments to farmers, and things like tariffs and non-tariff measures, which create price differentials between domestic prices and international prices, and therefore can favor, if you'd like, the domestic market, or not favor the domestic market. But we're calculating those numbers every year, and we produce a report which highlights both the global amount of support to agriculture and by OECD members, as well as some large emerging economies. This year, our number for support to agriculture was globally $842 billion US annually between the period of 2021 to 2023, going to agriculture globally. And only 12.6 of that is going towards what we categorize as investments in innovation. So here we're talking about investments in research and development, investments in biosecurity, investments in infrastructure in rural areas. And we see that that share of support to this really critical topic that we're talking about today, this innovation in order to get us towards better sustainability outcomes, that share has been decreasing in the past few years. So it's not going in the right direction. And we need to really be focusing on that. So yeah, so when we're talking about thinking about policy packages for governments, we talk a lot about needing to re-examine existing measures, because some of those measures may be, one, unnecessarily distorting markets, and two, creating incentives for actors within the food system to stay doing particular activities when actually what we need is maybe moving actors to move in different areas. Could I have the next slide, please? So then, just taking a little bit of a different angle now, if we're thinking about incentivizing innovation, yeah, you can. There's three squares, so you can add. Yeah, perfect. We're thinking about incentivizing innovations along supply chains. We're thinking about trying to shift behavior in a few different ways. We're publishing a report in a couple of weeks, which our committee declassified in December, which is talking about carbon footprint of food systems. But I think a lot of this can actually, a lot of the insights we're getting from this, which is around measurement issues along food supply chains, can be applicable for different kinds of sustainability parameters. But we focused in here on carbon footprint. So what we're looking at is three different kinds of shifts in behaviors and supply chains. So we want to shift to product categories that are having lower impacts. So a shift to lower emission, for example, when we're talking about carbon footprint. And we can also think about shifting producers with lower impact within each product category. So we're shifting sort of to lower emission producing dairy, for example, or we can think of levers that are actually shifting everybody in the sector to lower emission techniques to kind of align so that you get a big systems change. But whatever lever you're thinking about, if you can't measure what the outcome is along the supply chain and kind of line up those incentives, then you're not unlikely to actually be able to come up with really effective mitigation incentives. So if we're wanting to make progress in the area, what we've been arguing is that we really need to focus on data, thinking about product level environmental impact at different stages along the life cycle, at firm level data about environmental impact, and then the effect of all those different actions and how they're going to affect our environmental impacts in total. So what we've been thinking about, if I could have the last slide, and again, this resonates with, or not the last slide, the next slide. This resonates with messages that we've heard so far today already. There's a very complex landscape of reporting standards and guidelines. The private sector, as we've heard, are developing even shared metrics. So there's efforts to have harmonization within the private sector, but we have governments that are implementing voluntary standards and in some instances mandatory standards. We have NGOs who are shaping some of these conversations, and we also have international standard setting organizations like the ISO. And so we have another paper that came out last year called Fast and Furious, which is talking about how this landscape is changing so quickly, and there's so many different options in terms of how you measure. And it's when you dig into the measurement, you really have to get granular to understand how the measurement is actually affecting what you're tracking in terms of environmental sustainability outcomes. The question we've been asking is this a landscape where we're seeing a lot of collaboration and convergence, or are we moving in a direction that's becoming more fragmented? And if we're moving in this direction where there's more fragmentation, then there's a lot of concern that small and medium enterprises or developing countries who might have fewer resources to figure out how to comply with these standards are going to be disadvantaged. And so we need to be paying attention around that, and that there's a real need to think about how are we going to harmonize these measurements in order to align the incentives to move towards sustainable outcomes. So I just have a couple of more slides. This next slide is a summary slide of research that we're publishing in a couple of weeks that was declassified last year. We were asked by our members to do a stock take of trade measures that countries are implementing that are with an objective of having environmental impact in their trading partners. So we did a survey, we came up with 130 measures that are defined in different ways. So the bulk of them are defined through regional trade agreements. And here, these are, bilaterally negotiated trade agreements. And so presumably both of the partners, or if it's more than one, if it's more than a bilateral agreement, the partners have agreed to these different provisions. So there's environmental cooperation agreements, conditional preferential tariffs embedded in these RTAs, conditional TRQs are popping up in RTAs. And then we have measures that are autonomous. So some countries are at the border implementing measures, and I'll talk about them in a second. But what we've noticed over time is that in the past 4 years, more than half of these 130 measures have been introduced. So there's been an uptick in this interest by countries at a trade policy level in introducing these border measures. Some of the autonomous measures are ones that people on the call would be familiar with. So the conditional program eligibility measures that we have observed. So we have 6 in our data set, and they include a lot of them related to measures associated with feedstocks for biofuels to ensure that those feedstocks were produced in an environmentally sustainable way. And then we have another category that's called conditional market access, and we found 3 there. And the one that has been getting a lot of attention is the EU deforestation regulation. The commodities covered by these measures differ wildly. So we have palm oil, bioenergy, cattle, cocoa, soybean, and coffee that pop up the most. And what we've heard through our committee's discussions is that a lot of countries that are participating in the WTO in committees like the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee or the Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures have raised concerns about these measures that are defined in national regulatory frameworks. And the committee process at the WTO allows for countries to express concerns about draft measures or measures that are coming into force of their trading partners. And that mechanism is intended to try to preempt a dispute, to create a moment where countries can have a dialogue about what kinds of modifications to a measure would decrease the trade distorting nature of the measure that's in place. So there's a robust dialogue that happens in those committees, and the kinds of concerns that WTO members raise relate to the criteria that are being used to implement these border measures, whether or not there's really a clear, defined algebraic way, if you will, of calculating what the border measure is going to be based on, whether or not there's an existence already of international standards, and if there's any kind of mandatory due diligence as already creating an administrative barrier to trade. So there's a lot of discussion around these types of measures, and there's a lot of appetite to think about how trade measures interact with creating these incentives around environmental sustainability. In our OECD discussions, right now we're just trying to understand the world of these measures. Our next set of research that is over the next 2 years will be looking at whether or not we can distill some insights around design principles that would make those kinds of interventions less trade distorting and more aligned with the existing multilateral rules. So my last slide, just to wrap up. We know, of course, that trade is playing an important role in global food security, and we expect that there's likely to be trade disruptions in the coming years. So we need to keep an eye on that. Agriculture is already a very policy-heavy sector with a lot of market intervention and distortions. And so thinking about how to reposition the way those policies fit together is really important if we want to move in a sustainability direction. This evolving landscape of measures is creating a lot of challenges. There's lots of heterogeneous requirements for firms, and that can increase trade costs and have differential impacts for small and medium enterprises and for developing countries. We need to keep an eye on that. We need to keep an eye on trade wars, especially their potential detrimental impact on food security, and also the way that uncertainty can create disincentives for investments in these outcomes that we're trying to achieve. At the OECD, we think coordinated approaches are really a way to help level the playing field and can help reduce trade costs. So we're leaning into thinking about whether or not there's a way to facilitate this kind of dialogue. So again, I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Leanne. And at this time, we're going to invite all the panelists to come back on screen. Given the time constraints, I've asked the panelists to try to answer some of the questions in the function there by typing. But I do want to have one more round with our panelists as they come on here. And really I think the arc of your presentations, we wrestled with the trade and sustainability theme in the current environment. But in our final round here, I want to lean into the current environment a little bit more. There was one question about the challenges and opportunities in this tariff environment. And I might frame it a little more broadly of, in the current environment with the tariffs, what's next? At Farm Foundation, we look at alternatives or options and consequences. So, do you expect a trade war to linger? Do you expect to have renegotiations of current agreements? Do you expect new agreements? Do you expect new global or international organizations to pop up? What's next? And I'm going to honor Katie McRobert for her staying up in the middle of the night and kick off with you for the first word, and then probably go to Mark and Tyler. Katie.
Thanks, Sherry. I think our perspective really is that it's just such a fast-moving space, and things are surprising us so much that the uncertainty itself is the biggest factor in all of this. It's not what is happening, it is not what tariff might happen, it's not what agreements might be changed. It's the fact that everything is no longer certain. And for trade to function effectively, you do need certainty, you do need some sort of ability to plan forward in order to produce and know where the production is going. So the uncertainty itself is a very disruptive element for Australian agricultural producers. The flow-on effects globally of what might happen with US policy on then how China is likely to react, how China's position will then affect Asian neighbours, and how that will then flow back to Australia is extremely complex, but that is what we're watching very closely at the moment. So I think we probably will see some new relationships develop, whether they turn into formal agreements or not. It will be interesting, but certainly there'll be new alliances, and people will be turning their attention to different trading partners and different styles of trade agreements in the future. Other than that, it's just so confusing at the moment. It's very hard to make any sorts of predictions, and I'll hand over to my colleagues to see if they've got a better crystal ball than I do.
Tyler, do you want to respond next? Briefly, please.
Yeah, just to say, Sherry, that I think the answer is yes, it will result in new things, but what those new things are, I don't think anybody knows yet. But what we've realized is we can't take anything for granted anymore. And a big part of the solution, I think, in the Canadian context is not beyond our borders, but how do we do a better job domestically to better insulate ourselves from the unpredictability? And I think that there's this hope that it will last for 2 years. But I think that there's also increasing awareness that it's probably not, and it's something that's now going to be a long-term feature of global ag trade.
Thank you, Tyler. Mark, what's next?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a better answer than any of my colleagues, other than to say, I mean, there are some that would argue that the political agreement that the EU and the Mercosur, LATAM countries came to on Mercosur is evidence of an anticipation of things were changing. There's discussion about whether or not the EU would pivot more towards China, depending on how things work out with the US. I think that's speculation. What I hope is that the role that certainly organizations like OECD can play, the work that we do through GIFPI, that we have a fact-based discussion as far as possible, and we really get the understanding of those facts and what they mean out onto the table, and we start to discuss outcomes and not opinions and conjecture and so forth. When we have these discussions, the dialogue is absolutely crucial that we continue to have that, so that we build the understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So that's my hope. It's not necessarily an expectation generally, but it is my expectation of what GIFBI and our forum and hopefully organizations, if I may say, Leanne, that OECD will play.
Great, thank you. That's a pivot. I was going to go, Leanne, what do you think the role of international organizations like the WTO, OECD, and then if you want to weigh in on what's next with China, that would be also helpful since you have the global perspective.
Not so sure I can go in that direction, but the institutional question I would really like to comment on, because I think it's so important to, in a sense, honor the intention of these institutions, which was to set up a rules-based system where it would facilitate trusted engagement, because we need those that are engaged in the trading system to be trusting their trade partners. So we all can point to the things that haven't worked the way the founders, the wise people who drafted the WTO agreements thought that they would work. And it's such an important institution in terms of thinking about the principles that we need to all respect in order to have the trading system working effectively. I'd like to echo what Mark said about data and science, making sure that we're actually talking based on knowledge, and also figuring out how to bridge knowledge communities into policymaking communities, into actors within supply chains. So we need to respect that more and more. And the role of dialogue, which I think, again, this is a great example of bringing people together. It also takes time and it takes resources. And so the more we can find ways to facilitate that, I think the better we are and the more likely it is that we'll come up with collective solutions.
Thank you, Leanne. And we are actually at time, but Deborah, I want to give you just a few seconds to respond as well for what's next.
Well, I worry most about the markets right now and access to information. And because we're playing whack-a-mole, I think it's really important that we know and understand, how the markets are reacting versus what the longer term reality might be of the outcome. So that's one thing that's on my mind in terms of access to information and those who have it and those who do not. So that's the first thing. But long term, I mean, how to handle it is, every trade association, every business, whether you're big or small, needs to have an understanding of your trade exposure. And then work through, as Leanne said, work through, don't work at cross purposes right now to just get an immediate solution that sacrifices the long-term outcome, because Leanne used a really important word, which was trust. And trade is really about, our currency is trust, especially as it relates to the U.S. accessing export markets. So to the extent that commercial diplomacy can continue to work, and I know the associations and the export associations and companies are doing it, but I just want to restate that, right? That it's important to just maintain those commercial ties.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. And thank you to all of our panelists today for all of your insights during this challenging time. Deborah, I think you said trade is opportunity or facilitates opportunity. So that's what we will all hope for. And with that, over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you, panel, for the wonderful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but I have no doubt we'll be revisiting this topic again shortly. We appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey that you'll see at the conclusion of this forum. If you'd like to help us continue providing valuable programming such as this forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link provided at the top of the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities, and we're very grateful for your support. Thank you once again for joining us today, and this will now conclude the forum.